Boker Tov.
Yeah, serious guy. He lost story.
Yeah, but
Today's Parashat Shavua Shiur is sponsored by Steve, Leah Roth.
And Leah.
I said so. Should I say it louder? Steve and Leah Roth. And it's to commemorate the yard site of Leah's father, Hananya Yom Tov Lipa Ben Eliezer Zechrona Livrocha. The yard site was yesterday, Monday. So may the neshama have an aliyah, and we do thank you for sponsoring the last class of this semester. The last class before Pesach. We meet after Pesach, right after Pesach actually. On April 30th, we meet again. Okay, right after Pesach. But until then, we're going to be busy with this magnificent Yom Tov known as Pesach. We're going to be focusing on Parashat Shavua, which is Parashat Shmini, which if you do have the blue stone Chumash, you could find on page 588. So we'll start with a brief overview of what we will be reading this Shabbat. The word Shmini relate is the word eighth. It's the eighth day in the process of preparation for the inauguration of the tabernacle. And the 7 days leading to this eighth day are the last 7 days in the month of Adar, which were days when Moshe was in the process of finalizing, according to tradition, he actually constructed and deconstructed the tabernacle as a process of sanctification. On the eighth day, Moshe finally calls in the real players and the real doers in the Mishkan and the Mikdash, in the tabernacle, and then eventually in the temple. He calls Aharon Ubanav and the elders. And here he commands in verse 2 to go ahead and take a bull for a sin offering. There are many references here to the sin that they were dealing with, the sin of the golden calf. So that's the theme that relates to the first part of the parsha, which we're not going to be discussing in detail. So that's number 1. Number 2, on page 592, to appreciate what this parsha is about, is the tragic death on the first day of Nisan of Nadav and Avihu, the children of Aharon, for bringing what has been identified as the foreign fire. This is what we read on page 592, which was considered a great tragedy. The reaction of Aharon to what is taking place is silence. Vaidom Aaron, we are told. In verse 4 on page 592, when it came time to begin the process of giving kavod hamet, the proper honor to these righteous individuals and their burial, so we are told in verse 4, Vayikra Moshe, that Moshe calls Mishael and El Tzafan, and they were cousins to Aharon, and they were the ones that took charge of removing the remains, removing the bodies of Nadav and Avihu. There's actually significance in the names. We find this concept throughout Tanakh and of course in Torah itself, that when you see a name, especially a name that does not appear often, there's a message there in the name. And here when you are dealing with a tragedy, and this is a great tragedy indeed, because number one, it is, the loss of children for Aaron is something that is unimaginably painful. In addition, these are considered righteous individuals. So this is considered an event for all of the people of Israel that was quite overwhelming. And we have to deal, when we deal with pain of loss, we have to deal with the fact that it is as if God is not there. God has been as if removed from the picture. Isn't this a God of kindness? Isn't this a God of concern? Isn't this a God that is interested in doing good and not causing pain to humans and to his children, to the Jewish people? So the word mash, lo yamush, something that is detached or removed. Throughout Tanakh, the word mash has to do with removal. We get this sense when we deal with tragedy that God is mash, has been moved out of the picture. And obviously what we have to remind ourselves is that he still exists, but he is safun. Safun is concealed. Lehat spin. You go ahead and conceal, like when it comes to the Seder night, when you pull out the concealed food and eat it at the end of the meal, the afikoman, it is safun, that which is concealed. So the message of God moved, things don't seem right. Things don't seem right. And I remember 9.5 years ago when I came here, so one of my first stops, Elliot Feldman took me around on a tour of important things for a rabbi to see in Toronto. So what were the important things that Elliot took me to see as a rabbi here in Toronto? Was Steele's Memorial on Benjamin's. It's no joke. So in other words, to become familiar, unfortunately, and yes, I've been there a few times since at Steele's and even at Benjamin's. So we went to Benjamin's, and there it was a well-polished presentation done to the rabbi about their facility. And they even talked about their emblem, that the emblem of Benjamin's is that it's a Star of David, but it is detached a little bit. It's moved. Things are not as they should be. This is what the Magen David, which is nice symbolically. I mean, the message there is things are not as they should be, and that's why a section of the Star of David is not in place. It's mash. So when we feel the mash of kel, and that is obviously what is symbolized here in verse 4, Vaikra Moshe El Mishael. He calls Mishael mash. The fact that kel, God Almighty, is mash, is moved. But he also calls El Safan, that God is Safun. Don't think that he is not there, but God Almighty is concealed. He is concealed. He is still there. So this is the message and the symbolism that relates to these names that are brought into the picture. Now, the silence of Aharon, which you find at the end of verse 3, Vayidom Aharon, he was silent. What we find right afterwards, so now to see how things progress, page 594. So there are paragraphs that we have to turn to. So the first paragraph, which is verse 8 through 11, where he is told, do not drink. Commandment number 1 after the tragedy, right? Vaydaber Hashem el Aharon lemor. So God Almighty communicates to Aharon, Yain v'shachar, drink. To drink intoxicating wine, this is not the right thing to do. What does that have to do with anything? He just suffered a tragedy. Why is he talking about not drinking intoxicating beverages? So there's one tradition that the foreign fire, quote unquote, that the children of Aaron offered that brought about the tragedy was actually by the drinking of wine. They wanted to elevate themselves with some kind of external force. So therefore the alcohol is what they turn to feel that elevation. So therefore the commandment is presented now. That's one explanation. Explanation number 2 is that there's actually a statement in the Talmud that wine was created for us at times to deal with pain. We need something to soothe us, and alcoholic beverage Again, we shouldn't be always turning to it, but it has its place. It has its place. It's sometimes that you need to calm down. At this point, even though he is in a state of aninut/avelut, do not drink wine. Those are explanations that are presented. The next section has to do with the sacrifices of the day. But let's move on to our main discussion today on page 596, which has to do with teachings that Aharon will transmit to the next generation. So here we go. Verse 1, 2, 3, page 596, chapter 11. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aharon. So here Aharon is going to play a role in transmitting, in giving over the saying, le'emor aleihem, to go ahead and be sure to tell the people of Israel. The language here is very different. In most cases of the Torah, it's Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Here, number one, you have Aharon as well. And number two is le'emor aleihem, to tell them. And it is as if we are being told that this is something that should always be in play, that those who receive the tradition will one day transmit it to the next generation, to those who are not here. Okay, a very significant concept, because Judaism is all about continuity, and the continuity is achieved when these values and teachings are transmitted. So we are told, Dabru el bnei Yisrael le'emor, in verse 2, you should tell the people of Israel that I'm going to give you now a list of animals that should and should not be consumed. And we have, the first time in the Torah, a detailed list of kashrut. What animals we eat, which fish we do eat, which ones have a kosher signs, which ones do not. So here we have it, the laws of kashrut. Why specifically are these laws presented right after the passing of the children of Aharon? Why is Aaron playing a role in transmitting these laws when Moshe is in general viewed as the one that teaches the Torah, not Aharon? So, we have to go back to the word Vaidom Aharon. Aaron dealing with his pain in silence. God Almighty turns to him and says, you know what? You are in pain. Remaining silent, remaining detached from communication, from society, is not the way to deal with it. You have to come out, right? You have to come out of it. You have to interact with people. And therefore, I'm going to be presenting to you these laws that are transmitted orally. You can't rely just on books for the laws of kashrut. There has to be some kind of oral transmission, which we call a masorah. Misorah, very key word. And it works as follows. Let's talk a little bit, and today our main discussion is going to be about birds. Now, for me personally, it's amazing how much I'm fascinated by something I know absolutely nothing about, and that are birds. But some people have expertise. And I remember there was someone I knew as a kid that would listen to recordings of different birds, their sounds and their chirping, and he was able to identify these birds, and he developed expertise, a very brilliant child who developed expertise in the field of birds. Today's a Rosh Hashiva, so I don't know exactly how one relates to the other, but obviously a bright young man. Now, birds are fascinating. And when it comes to birds, first of all, yes, I would assume most people in this room at times do eat birds as well. We eat chicken, right? Some of us eat turkey. Masorah. So here's the key. The key word, it works as follows. The Torah itself, if we're going to go ahead and turn to page 600, and in page 600, the Torah is going to give a list of the non-kosher birds. Very interesting, because when it came to the animals, we were given a list of 7 kosher animals. When it came to the fish, all we are provided are simanim. They have the fins, they have the scales. You don't need anything else. You could go fishing in the Pacific, right? You could go fishing, or you could go fishing in South America, or you could walk through the marketplace in Santiago, Chile. And if you see a fish there that has the fins on the scales, even if you have no idea what is the corvina, how do you say it in English? Doesn't make a difference. The fins and scales, what is it? Some kind?
Barramundi.
That's the English name? We'll stick with corvina. So even if you have absolutely no knowledge in the field, the signs are good enough. When it comes to birds, the Torah provides a list of 24 non-kosher birds. And what we are told is the following, that if you find a bird and you are confident that it's not one of the 24, it's considered kosher. The problem is, we do not know the 24 birds. They're talking about main categories. They have subcategories. You find a bird somewhere in Africa, you have no idea. Perhaps it's one of those birds. So what do? So the Talmud tells us the key here is to find out that it is not a predator. If it's not a predator, you'll know that it's a kosher bird. How do you know for a fact it's a predator? Or if it's not a predator? So there's been a lot of discussion, and there's an old tradition that if it has a webs on its feet and it has a beak that is sticking out, you could assume it's not a predator. A lot of halachic discussion. Bottom line is, says the Ramah, for us Ashkenazim, we only eat bird if we have a masoret, if there was a shochet, or if there was a rabbi who could go ahead and show you the bird and say, this is the bird that I do remember in the Altaheim, in the old home eating, this is something that you could eat. Then there's the question, well, can I rely on a masoret of someone else? In other words, what if I find a Yemenite Jew and he has a masoret? Can I transfer that to a new location? So the halachic discussion enters into the fact, analyzes this case. You have to figure out if in a community that it wasn't used, was it because they were just lacking knowledge, or perhaps they had a tradition not to eat that bird? A detailed, complex area of halacha, which relates obviously to the turkey, which you are familiar with. How on earth are we eating turkey when it comes from the New World? How do we have a masoret on it? How can you have a tradition about turkey when in Europe they never saw a turkey until the late 16th century? So how exactly did that become a permissible bird to many of us? Not all, right? There are those that don't eat turkey, or some of those that don't like turkey, right? Always was good. So the most conventional explanation given is that among Sephardim they have a little bit more leniency, because if the bird itself does not act like a predator, they rely on the fact that it has some kosher simanim, some kosher signs, and would deem the bird kosher. So it is very possible that the merchants who brought it to the European communities were Sephardi. There was a book called the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. In other words, Jews were involved in the industry of commerce and transporting goods from the New World to the Old World were often done by Sephardi Jews. And for example, that's why you take the turkey. Why is it called the turkey? Because it was the Turkish who brought it. When it comes to corn, why did Ashkenazi Jews call corn Turkish wheat? That's how it was called by Ashkenazi. Because the Turks, Jews, the center of the Jewish world in the 16th century was obviously Turkey. So therefore, these merchants were the ones who brought it. So there are different explanations as to why. Not our main discussion today. But what you do need to know is that there is a concept of masoret. And the beauty of masoret is that you cannot rely on a book. You have to interact with a person. You have to hear it from a teacher. You have to hear it from a master. Yeah, David.
So if the category is non-predatory, then why do we need a list of 24?
So the Talmud shares with us a story that there was a specific bird that they assumed was not a predator, and then one day they found out otherwise based on his actions. And Rashi tells us that story is presented in the Talmud to tell us we don't know for a fact. In other words, it could be it's not acting like one for the time being, but then suddenly 1, 7, 8, 9 years, or maybe a few decades later it would be, so therefore rely on the Masorah. This is what Rashi shares with us. And there, yes?
What was the bottom line with the turkey? The Masorah was from the Sephardim. They brought it to the Europeans, so we were able to accept the Masorah from another community?
So it could be that once it came from these Torah Jews, and they said it's fine, meaning for us it's fine. For the Ashkenazi Jews, they read it as, we have a Masorah. And they didn't really know where the Masorah is. One of the Ashkenazi authorities writes that obviously this bird comes from India, because it comes from the New World, and the New World for them was India. And most probably the rabbis in India had a Masorah. That's how he writes, without knowing exactly that it's not exactly from India, but rather from the New World, from Indians. Yeah, the Indians, right.
So then can you accept the Masorah from another from community?
So that comes the question, if let's say, this is a broad question about grasshoppers, for example. Not that too many of us are really waiting to have our roasted grasshoppers in our oatmeal, but nevertheless, these are interesting discussions that halakhic authorities touch upon. Now, when it comes to a predator, it's not just if you see the bird attacking another bird or holding it down and chewing on it while it's alive, but the Talmud notes that if you, for example, see a bird that has 4 toes, and you place it on a string, and it separates them two and two, that's a sign that it is a predator. This is what the Talmud, like a Kohanim. That's a sign that they are predators. This is what the Talmud tells us. You said this. Now, so what happened is that 18 years ago, there was a person who was a mashgiach watching a few of the leghorns, the most common chickens that lay eggs, and it was actually on a string for some time with the 2 and 2 formation, and he went crazy. Maybe all our eggs come from a non-kosher species and are thus not kosher. So all the halakhic authorities got together and addressed it, and they brought rabbis to watch this chicken, and they noted that for a few seconds it might place itself in the 2 and 2 formation, but it's not comfortable only when it's with a 3 and 1. So they calm down. Anyway, bottom line is, Masoret is just communication, where there is nothing more therapeutic for us when we are experiencing pain to communicate with others. And if we have tools that we could go ahead and, man search for meaning. If you have tools, if there's information you have, and you transmit it to the next generation, and you recognize the value in the words you utter, there is nothing more satisfying, and that's how you break out of pain. Pain should not be addressed by locking yourself up. Pain means sometimes it's not comfortable, it's not easy, but to talk, and talk about things that have value and purpose, right? It could be, there is a level of satisfaction if we go ahead and have a conversation about, the latest issue in politics. These things perhaps could be satisfying on the surface only. When we, on the other hand, feel that what we are transmitting are values, right? Appreciation of God, appreciation of our tradition, somehow that gives us that boost, that feeling that we are achieving something. Masoret is the way you deal with pain. But now, what we're going to do, all this is an introduction. Page 600, so now we'll start our actual discussion. What we're going to do is, we're going to focus on 2 out of the 24 birds that are mentioned here, 2 out of 24. And we're going to talk about traditions and rabbinic statements that relate to these birds. So what are the birds that are not kosher? So in verse 14, we are presented with the nesher, which is translated by some as the eagle, not by all. Some say it's a hawk. Number 2 was a parrot. I do remember as a kid in the 1981 election in Israel, they did mention it often that one of the non-kosher birds is the parrot. This is something I do recall. And it mentions there the ozniya, and you could spend a lot of time in your own research on looking at old translations of Sadia Gaon and of earlier authorities what these birds are. And the list continues with some ravens, with the bat haya'ana. But then we're going to focus on verse 17 and on verse 18. Verse 17, the kos, the shalach, so that's going to be bird number 1, which we're going to be spending some time on. and the Yanshuf, which is translated even in modern Hebrew as the owl. Okay? Next, verse 18, Tinshomet, Ka'at, and Racham. Racham. Relates to the word Rachmanis. Okay, Rachmanis, which the Talmud is going to go ahead and deal with. So, when we want to be inspired about our tradition, or really to find some kind of meaning in our existence, in this fragile existence that we call life, we turn to the text of Torah. But there are two other things that we need to do after we put on the Torah glasses and the Torah outlook. And that is to study history and to study nature. And there's a big, big mitzvah in studying Jewish history. Zechor Yemot Olam. Study history, but for the right reason. Right? All historians have agendas. Right? Everyone has an agenda, as we know. And often when you come to a history department, they want to go ahead, and their agenda to show is that Europeans are racist and terrible people, and they did awful things by conquering the New World. Right? And therefore, and even I remember in Memphis, going back some 12 years ago, the theme of the department was Europe is terrible, and we're trying to figure out why did they succeed. Like, must be that they were awful people. That was the agenda of their history department. Therefore, there's a big push now to study what they call big history, like the book called *Sapiens*, which became very, very popular. They want to talk about big history. The guns. There's another book, the fellow Diamond. Germs. Steel. Right. This goes back a few years. Again, it's the big history of. We don't want to only focus on the Europeans because we don't want to be Eurocentric. Right. You have to study other cultures as well. I remember the first time I met Schneur Lyman, Sid Lyman, who was considered probably the greatest man when it comes to halachic and Jewish history. A brilliant individual. I know he spoke here in the shul, Sid Lyman, Schneur Lyman, a few decades ago. And he's a person that I could call him, and I've tried this in the past, with any old book from 3 centuries ago, and if I would read to him the Sharblat, which is the cover page, he would give me all the editions of when it was printed, and if it's rare, if it's not rare. One of those minds that you get very uncomfortable with, because you say, how on earth can a human know so much? But that was Sid Lyman. So Sid Lyman told me his story, that in the late 1950s, early 1960s, he decided to focus on Judaic studies. And his dad said, in Judaic studies, like, what are you going to do with it? Like, there are no professors for Judaic studies. He said, I don't care, I'm interested, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And he notes that the big mess happened is that right as he was graduating, universities started on black studies, or African American studies, or African studies. So the Jews were able, and these are his words, the Jews were able to go ahead and turn to departments within universities and say the following: if we have focus on them, right, while they were hanging from trees, we were writing literature. Should we not have Jewish studies? And that's how they brought Jewish studies into the picture. This is what Sid Lyman told me. History is important. However, good topic, coffee time. Zechor Yemot Olam. Jews study history, but realize that it's not random, that there's a God, that there are reasons for things. And I think it's very, very hard to be sitting in 18th century Vienna or 17th century Poland and say that history has some kind of direction, when the only direction for the Jews seems to be from exile to exile. But still, Klal Yisrael was commanded to go ahead and study it, and somehow find the hand of God. Not easy. Today, with all that's happening, it should be easy, because you gotta actually close your eyes, right, and put on blindfolds to not see the incredible developments that are occurring to our nation over the past 120, 30 years. I mean, you gotta be, let's spell it out. You gotta be stupid not to see that some incredible things have occurred. some unimaginable tragedies, but at the same time, from the ashes, look what the people of Israel built. You gotta be a fool not to realize that the events that occurred yesterday in the White House are not normal, are simply abnormal. Abnormal. You like him or you don't like Mr. Trump. Reality is, number one, no one expected him to ever win the primaries in the Republican Party. Find me one person, right? I know one person that predicted it, but he also says that we never reached the moon, that it was all created in Hollywood. You hear the message is, in general, people that are experts couldn't have predicted anything. Now look what's happening. Is this random? You really think that this is just happening as a result of a random occurrence? Or there is perhaps a God that has some kind of plan? I don't know what it is. I know I have to be grateful, right? We as Jews, so two things you have to do as a good Jew. Study history, appreciate the history of the past century, understand the depth of it, and number two, study nature. So two of our birds are going to help us. One of them is going to help us to study history, and one to appreciate nature. And we're going to start with history. So now, there's a statement in the Talmud. The Talmud, the scholars of the Talmud actually knew what the Racham was. They knew. In other words, there was a bird that was in the region in Babylonia there, and they pointed to the bird and they say, that is the Racham. What was the name of the bird, as the Jews called it there in Babylonia? The Shrakrak. Shrakrak. Okay? It relates to the word Shrika, which is like a whistle. A whistle. The whistle is shrok, modern Hebrew, right? And anyone supporting my modern Hebrew statements, lishrok, racham zo sharak. Now, why exactly, or how did the rabbis find meaning in it? So they say the following, that when the racham makes its sound, ba rachamim la'olam. Rachamim, there's mercy. What kind of mercy comes to the world? So it seems to be rain. That before the rain comes, these, I think they call them in English, I looked up, the bee-eating birds. Not a very scientific name, I don't know the Latin, but they call them the bee-eating birds. These are magnificent colored birds that are in the region of Southern Asia. And these birds, if according to these experts, is the shrakrak. It starts making these sounds, these whistles, before the rain comes. You hear those sounds, you know there's going to be mercy from above. The farmer will actually have produce. So they relate the racham, which is the word of the Torah, to the shrakrak, which is the whistle. Fine. But then the rabbis in the Talmud Ad, you got a picture right, okay? The rabbis in the Talmud Ad, you should know that we actually in our tradition have a future reign that relates to the redemption, when God Almighty is going to have mercy on us from above and give us life again, which is the redemption. So the rabbis have a tradition that you should know, that if this bird is going to be perched in a specific type of position and will be making its sounds of the shrika of its whistle, you should know that the redemption is coming. So the rabbis tie the shrakrak not just to the rachmanut of the rain, but to the rachmanut of HaKadosh Baruch Hu bringing about the geula. Fine. And there are many interesting discussions to it. In other words, some see it as a concept that when we get a whistle from Israel, like when someone wants to indicate that they are here and they want you to come, they're going to whistle. Right? Some people have superstition with no whistling indoors. You ever hear that? I once whistled, and no, you're not allowed to whistle indoors. I think you're allowed to, okay? But the idea is that when you hear someone whistling, it's a sign, come. And some see it as a sign that when from Eretz Yisrael you hear a little bit of a whistle, it's a sign, kum tarain, come here. Right? Maybe it's a sign, it's hard to talk about this. Maybe it's a sign that in 1918, 1920, right, there was a whistle, a little bit of a whistle, not more, right, because the Brits, flipped very fast. There was a little bit of a whistle make your way to Eretz Yisrael. I've shared here this story that in the early 1930s, my great aunt, and Rachale, she was perhaps 17 or 18. So her father was the rabbi in Alitus in town. He was no longer alive. They lost him when he was a very young man, but they still treated the family as the Rav's family. My great-grandmother decided to make her way to Eretz Yisrael, which is obviously not easy, but she had her 17-year-old daughter get up in shul on the bima, this is in Lithuania, and she clapped and she gave a drosha, and she said everyone should come to Israel. Everyone should come to Israel. That was her teaching as a 17-year-old. I remember visiting her. She lived till she was 99, and she was she's an author. She wrote on Eov. She was a very fascinating woman, and Rachale. But she said, you got to come to Israel. Europe is not a good place. She said this in the early 1930s. She heard the whistle. Shrak-rak, shrika. Now, what's interesting is the following. We, as traditional Jews, have been believing in the redemption for centuries. If you would ask anyone, any traditional Jew 300 years ago, how is the redemption going to occur? So you're going to say, well, a righteous rabbi, the Mashiach, is going to come with the long gebard, right? And he's going to say everyone, Yidin, gates to Eretz Yisrael. Make your way to Eretz Yisrael, Mashiach is here. However, these sounds of the redemption, yes, they came from a person with the long beard, which is Herzl, but it wasn't exactly the traditional Torah Jew. And this was the great struggle of the early 20th century. How do we deal with this quote-unquote redemption process when it is led by these people who are not kosher? How do we deal with it? Right? This is a serious question, not an easy one, especially for someone that was raised in a way of thinking. It's very hard to get out of that box. How do you deal with it? So one of the greatest who dealt with this was Rabbi Sachar Shlomo Teichtal. Rabbi Teichtal, we've talked about him in the past. He was a traditional Hungarian rabbi, and with all due respect to the Hungarian roots in this town, the Hungarian Rabbonim were the most right-wing, anti-Zionist more than anyone else, more than the Polish, and obviously more than the Lithuanian. For the Hungarian rabbis, it is impossible that a redemption could come about with people that are quote-unquote not kosher. But he writes Rabbi Teichtal, that you should know we shouldn't be guessing God. And look at this list. The list of birds, of non-kosher birds, includes the racham, which is the shrak-rak. And the rabbis tell us that this non-kosher bird is going to produce a whistle, which is a sign for the redemption. So we have a source for this idea. And he says, don't question God, but look at our tradition. This is not far-fetched. This is something that he cried out. Now, obviously, it was too late for him because he's writing this already in 1944, when it was too late for Hungarian Jewry. But he changed completely his outlook during the years of the war, leading to the eventual destruction, that we cannot have such an attitude, that we were wrong. We were simply wrong, we right-wing, and he was a tremendous and well-respected Torah scholar. Our attitude towards the Tzionim was simply a wrong attitude. We should have listened to the non-kosher bird. He studied the history, right? And even though he's not alive, he did not survive. His works have inspired many. That's what we could learn from bird number one, the Racham. Okay? Now, if you want to be a good Torah Jew, there's something else we have to do. We have to study nature. You got to know science. But again, the proper study of science is with the Torah outlook. I highly recommend that everyone, when they have time, sit down with Tehillim 104, which is Baruchi Nafshi, and study it. It's really worthwhile to sit down and study what it means. The next Rosh Chodesh, when you read it, which there's a tradition of reading it about the renewal of nature, you know that there's some incredible words there about King David sitting there in the mountains and being inspired by the gazelles, by being inspired by nature, by the shfanim, sleim machsele shfanim. In other words, looking at the natural cycle and saying, wow, such brilliance. That is what we have to do. We have an obligation. There was a book I mentioned here, The Secret Lives of Trees. Remember we talked about, I mentioned it here? An incredible piece of literature because it inspires us to realize there's such wisdom in nature, re'umi barayel, and realize and recognize that this is not random. This is what we have to do. So studying birds, not that, again, I have zero expertise, fascination, yes, is one area. So today we're going to go ahead and study the shalach. We're going to go ahead and study the shalach. So now, what is the shalach? So, two translations I've seen. Number one, the pelican. Pelican, okay? Now, usually you relate pelican to the Gulf of Mexico, probably, but nevertheless, there are those that say it's the pelican, and we'll see soon a source in the Talmud for it. Number two is the cormorant. Okay? Now, why, how on earth did these, you've seen the cormorants? You went to see the fishing? Oh, you're so lucky. What?
Thailand.
You saw the actual fishing of the cormorant? Boy,
Yeah.
we have to talk about them because that's fascinating. So here we go. Now, how do we know? Because the Talmud takes the word shalach, and the Talmud tells us the following. You want to know what the shalach is? Ze ha-sholeh. Sholeh is to draw out, to draw, to fish out. Ha-sholeh dagim min hayam. Sholeh dagim min hayam. So I think the pelican fits in, right? And also the cormorant. Okay. Now, comes Rav Yochanan. When Rav Yochanan, the Talmud tells us the following. Rav Yochanan followed my advice, and he would watch birds, and he would be inspired. So the Talmud tells us that the great Rav Yochanan, when he would see the shalach, when he would see this shalach in action, he would turn to God and he would say a verse from Tehillim, Mishpatecha, your justice, Tehom Rabbah, reaches the depths. Your justice reaches the depths. What is Rabbi Yochanan talking about? So Rashi gives two explanations. Okay, explanation number one of Rashi. When a few summers ago, I was with Abigail in Florida, in this summer. And there are more pelicans, at least it appears to me with my zero expertise, that there are more pelicans in Florida, in South Florida, around Boca, in the summer than in the winter. In the winter you can't find so many, in the summer we saw many. Sitting there at a specific location, at the beach, I'm not telling you where because it's private and I want to keep it that way. So there's a specific beach there in Boca. And we're sitting there and we see the pelicans and we see them taking their dive. And it was incredible. We both loved watching them. Right? You see them taking the dive for lunch, makes its way back up. Think about that poor fish. He was not going to a hook, right? He wasn't going to take a worm that was connected to some string where you heard rumors that perhaps there's a chance that you don't survive that. He was just taking a parvis swim in the water. The next thing he knows, what happens? He's lunch, he's gone. Right? Mishpatecha, so that's what Rabbi Yochanan is talking about. Mishpatecha, according to explanation number one of Rashi, Mishpatecha, your justice to this poor fish is like the depth of the ocean. You know, something that happens out of nowhere, you don't expect it, and you see what we call the Midat Hadin, the justice of the Almighty. We don't understand it. He was inspired when he saw the pelican taking that fish. So, explanation number one is that the justice was on the fish, that out of nowhere was God. Finished, lunch. Okay? Now, explanation number two of Rashi, Rashi notes the following, that you should know that this shalach is one that God judged the bird that for him to get his lunch, he has to go ad tehom rabbah. He has to go to the bottom of the ocean. The cormorant makes its way. So the wolves did see how they went in Thailand, and they tie, if I understand correctly, to the neck of these cormorants a string. They throw them into this pond. The cormorant comes out with a fish in his mouth, and they say shkayach to him, and they take out the fish. And probably the small ones do go down, that cormorant gets something, but the groise, the big fish, and they do fishing with it. This was an old tradition. Now, how far down do they go to get the fish? So Rav Yochanan tells us, Mishpatecha, the justice of the cormorant is such that they have to go to the tehom, to the bottom of the ocean. So what he's saying basically is that some people get their food easy, right? Other people have to go make their way to the bottom, ad the tehom, the bottom of the ocean. Fine. Fascinating explanation, very inspiring. So now, I went on the internet, and about 7 years ago, in Argentina, a group of scientists, this is from National Geographic, by the way, not the National Enquirer, a group of scientists studied the imperial cormorant, and they connected to the back of the neck of these birds a camera, like a lipstick, size of camera. GoPro, a tiny, klein of GoPro. And they noted that these birds jump into the water and are going deeper and deeper and deeper, something like 50 meters, I think, to get their fish. They go all the way to the bottom. And National Geographic noted that scientists were never aware of how deep these fish go to get their food. So I note, perhaps scientists didn't know, but Rav Yochanan knew. Rav Yochanan was aware, ad tehom. Okay, they studied the science and they were inspired by it. So that's part number 2 of something we could take from our birds. Part number 1 was to be inspired by history, and number 2 by science, like watching the birds. And this is Kedai, for the few days that I merit to be in your Hasher winter home in Florida, right? And you see birds there, right? And there's something magnificent, even if you study how they eat, how they move, how they interact, how everything is tailored for them, right? The beak is like everything is constructed with perfection. It is something that we have to do as Torah Jews, realize that there's wisdom in nature, and I think that the Shalach is a magnificent example of something we could do to appreciate this magnificent world and its creator. So that's what we have for Parshas Shmini. Thank you again to our sponsors, Neshama Shalom Aliyah, and thank you again for coming throughout the semester. We'll see you Be'ezras Hashem after Pesach. There is a class next Wednesday night also as well on Pesach.